Speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
Imagine you are the King of the United Kingdom, sitting in a private study at Sandringham. You expect a routine briefing on agricultural yields and staff management, the kind of mundane paperwork that fills a monarch's day. Instead, one single folder changes the entire atmosphere of the room in seconds. Inside, there isn't just a proposal. There is a detailed private strategy bearing Queen Camilla's signature for the disposal of selected estate parcels. It's all there: market valuations, lists of prospective high-net-worth buyers, and a timeline for divestment that has advanced far beyond casual discussion. The king doesn't shout. He doesn't throw the file. He simply stops reading, sets the pages down with a steady hand, and asks one quiet question that freezes everyone in the room. He wants to know exactly who else has seen this plan. Before we dive into the fallout of this discovery and what it reveals about the power dynamics behind palace doors, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to Prime Royal Central so you never miss an update on the stories the monarchy keeps behind closed gates. Now, stay with me, because this isn't just about property. For Charles, Sandringham is not an asset class or a financial burden. It is the family's private country retreat, separate from the Crown estate, meaning it is the one place where he is a landlord, a father, and a son, rather than a sovereign. It carries the weight of Christmas gatherings, the silence of his father's final days, and the echoes of Queen Elizabeth II's long tenure. To sell a piece of this land isn't a business decision in his eyes. It is an act of erasure. When he turned the page and saw the name of an outside property consultancy, his expression shifted from surprise to something colder. He realized that while he was living in the history of the estate, someone else was already mapping out its liquidation. He removed his glasses, looked at his advisors, and repeated the question. The silence that followed was an admission of guilt. Camilla hadn't just prepared a report. She had quietly initiated a process, and in the rigid hierarchy of the royal household, that is a breach of protocol that feels indistinguishable from betrayal. Camilla, for her part, viewed this as responsible stewardship. She had been warned by estate managers that maintaining every acre and every crumbling cottage to 20th century standards was becoming a financial sinkhole. She saw figures in red. He saw ghosts of the past. That fundamental disconnect had simmered for years. But now, it had breached the surface. She hadn't just challenged his judgment. She had bypassed his authority to invite strangers into the family's most private circle. If this were purely a matter of money, it would be a board meeting. Because it involves the legacy of his parents, it became a collision between a marriage and a monarchy. And the deeper Charles looked into the file, the more he realized this wasn't a sudden impulse. It was a months-long campaign of preparation. So how did a simple disagreement over maintenance costs escalate into a full-scale confrontation? To understand that, you have to look back at a winter evening months earlier. During a quiet Christmas dinner, the atmosphere had been warm, but the conversation turned to the mounting costs of estate upkeep. Charles had dismissed the topic within minutes, waving it away as a problem for another day. It was a classic royal deflection. If you don't acknowledge the bill doesn't exist. Camilla, however, did not let it go. While he went to bed believing he had ended an uncomfortable subject, she stayed behind. She took the estate estimates, folded them, and tucked them into her personal folder. That single action was the point of no return. She decided then that if the king would not make the difficult choices to protect the estate's future solvency, she would have to do the groundwork herself. She began quietly contacting advisors to identify parcels that could be sold off without disrupting the core of the estate or the main residence. Her goal was surgical: find the dead weight, the outlying fields and derelict cottages, and convert them into capital. But in the world of high-end real estate, nothing stays quiet for long. One of the parcels she targeted had unexpectedly surged in value due to local infrastructure developments. Suddenly, what was a modest restructuring plan turned into a high-stakes sale that caught the eye of serious investors. When Charles realized that a prospective buyer had actually requested a second meeting, the room changed. Exploration had become momentum. The king was no longer looking at an internal memo. He was looking at a train that had already left the station. When Camilla finally entered the study to face him, the tension was suffocating. No aides, no secretaries, and no buffers. The file sat between them, like a physical barrier. Charles didn't need to raise his voice to make his point. He simply pointed to the document and told her, "You went behind me." She didn't retreat. She stood her ground, arguing that his attachment to the land was blinding him to the reality of the family's fiscal future. She pointed out that she had purposefully avoided the main house and the areas tied to his deepest memories, trying to preserve his heritage while securing the estate's sustainability. But to Charles, that was a distinction without a difference. The betrayal wasn't about the land itself. It was about the secrecy. It was about the fact that she had trusted outside consultants with the future of his inheritance before she had gained his agreement. He pushed the map across the table, his finger tracing a boundary line. He asked her how she could have authorized professional valuations of his parents' legacy without telling him. She countered that every time she tried to raise the topic of modernization, he would shut down the conversation, forcing her to find a way to make him see the necessity of her actions. It was a stalemate of values. She was protecting the institution from stagnation. He was protecting his soul from a world that wanted to sell it off by the acre. As the argument reached its peak, Charles realized that his title offered him no protection here. Being the king didn't change the fact that this was a private marital confrontation where his royal prerogative held no sway. The legal mechanisms of the estate were already turning, and the possibility of stopping the process without creating a public scandal began to look increasingly remote. As the meeting dissolved, Prince William entered the room. Sensing the immediate shift in the air, he walked into a scene of cold, calculated silence, with his father gripping the edge of the table and the estate lawyers standing by, waiting for orders that might change the history of Sandringham forever. This is where the walls of the palace started to close in, and where the real danger to the family's reputation began. If you want to know how William tried to navigate this divide between his father's past and his stepmother's future, and what happened when the lawyers finally spoke, you need to catch the next part of this series. Make sure you are subscribed to Prime Royal Central and have those notifications turned on, because the conclusion of this story reveals just how close the monarchy came to a very public and very painful division. The moment Prince William stepped into that private briefing room, he could immediately feel the atmosphere. King Charles was standing over the mahogany conference table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge. Opposite him stood the estate's lead legal counsel, meticulously laying out just how far the machinery of divestment had already moved behind the monarch's back. Now, watch this detail closely. Sandringham is not official crown land managed by the government. It is private royal property owned outright by the family. That distinction made Camilla's secret initiative deeply personal, but it certainly didn't make the legal process informal. Land transfers of this magnitude require rigorous title searches, structural valuations, tax reviews, and drafted contracts before any deed can change hands. Charles listened to the lawyer in absolute silence. Humiliation burned beneath his composure. Every single advisor in that room knew the intricate details of a proposal he had only discovered hours ago. They knew which specific parcels of land had been surveyed, which high-net-worth buyers had been approached, and what valuations had been placed on his family's private history. To a reigning king, that realization was devastating. He had inherited the ultimate responsibility for the estate, yet he was the very last person to find out that its liquidation was already being calculated. Camilla, however, refused to act completely repentant. She held her ground, maintaining that exploring financial options was not the same as signing a final contract. No land had officially changed hands yet. She insisted that rising maintenance costs, severe inflation, deferred repairs on heritage cottages, and ongoing staff payroll obligations could no longer be swept under the rug. Charles heard the administrative logic, but he couldn't detach it from the months of deliberate secrecy that brought it to his desk. So what made this situation vastly more complicated for the king? It was the tiered structure of the proposal itself. The file contained a staged disposal plan, meaning individual parcels of Sandringham could be sold off incrementally over several years to avoid attracting sudden media scrutiny. That meant even if Charles immediately froze the current negotiations, the underlying financial pressure wouldn't vanish. The maintenance deficits remained. The structural obligations remained. Closing the folder didn't solve the problem, it merely delayed the reckoning. And that is precisely why Prince William's arrival changed the dynamic in the room completely. One day the burden of managing and funding these private royal estates will fall directly on his shoulders. Any decision made or avoided today fundamentally shapes what the future sovereign will inherit tomorrow. William deeply sympathized with his father's sense of betrayal over the covert planning. Yet as he examined the ledger sheets, he recognized an uncomfortable truth. Camilla's underlying financial projections were factually sound. Charles looked to his son, expecting total, unreserved emotional backing. Instead, the first major rift occurred when William spoke with measured caution, admitting that the estate's long-term financial numbers simply could not be ignored forever. To a monarch already reeling from his wife's actions, his son's pragmatic stance felt like a second blow. William made it crystal clear that he vehemently opposed decisions made without total transparency. However, he also made a cold, realistic observation. The monarchy cannot preserve every single square mile of private real estate in perpetuity simply because it carries emotional weight. Some underutilized holdings demand excessive security, staff and upkeep that will eventually cripple future generations. Charles stood alone by the estate map after William exited the room. In a silent, deeply emotional gesture, he began picking up the colored boundary markers indicating the proposed sales and placed them face down on the table one by one. To him, memories tied to his late parents were being reduced to balance sheets by the very people closest to him. At the same time, Camilla began to realize the true magnitude of the damage. She had convinced herself that she was taking on the unpleasant financial duties everyone else was too nostalgic to face. But seeing Charles process the secrecy made her realize he was now questioning the foundational trust of their marriage. The Queen Consort didn't abandon her stance on estate economics, but she completely stopped defending the covert manner in which she had acted. In an official handover to the estate management team, she voluntarily surrendered every scrap of personal correspondence, initial valuation, and private email exchange with the property consultants. Charles acted instantly. He issued a binding royal directive freezing all external discussions regarding the Sandringham parcels. No prospective buyers would receive a call back. No property advisors would move forward with contract drafts. The king had officially halted the legal machinery. But stopping a sale is infinitely easier than repairing fractured trust. Camilla accepted the freeze without protest, recognizing that fighting through lawyers and advisors would only widen the chasm between them. Both knew that the ultimate resolution couldn't happen through paperwork, estate managers, or intermediary messages passed through William. They had to face each other without an audience. When Charles and Camilla finally sat down alone, without advisors, courtiers, or titles between them, the tone of the conflict shifted entirely. They stopped arguing over agricultural yields and market valuations. For the very first time since the folder surfaced, they spoke directly about their core fears. Charles admitted his deep-seated fear that the world he inherited, along with the physical places connecting him to his late parents and childhood Christmases, was being dismantled piece by piece before his eyes. Camilla shared her own fear that refusing to adapt to modern economic realities would leave William inheriting a financially unsustainable burden that could embarrass the crown later. She slid the original Christmas estimate back across the table, acknowledging openly that she should have brought it to him directly rather than quietly building a case through external advisors. That direct admission broke the tension. Charles, in turn, conceded that his original refusal to even discuss estate costs had created the very silence in which her secret plan developed. Together, they established a strict, new governing principle for the family's private holdings. No Sandringham land carrying historical, emotional, or family significance would ever be put up for sale. Non-sensitive peripheral properties could still be evaluated for restructuring, but only jointly, transparently, and with full collective family consent. Charles then brought William directly into the estate's future governance, turning a secret proposal into an open succession plan. Take a look at what happened next, because the internal resolution arrived a moment too late. Before the palace could consolidate its new strategy, information regarding the frozen land deals began to leak outside the estate walls. By the following morning, a private marital disagreement over land management had turned into a full-blown national media frenzy. The headlines transformed an internal estate review into a public debate over privilege, modern royal finances, and legacy. Journalists debated whether historic royal properties should remain untouchable out of emotion or be modernized to reflect fiscal realities. Charles felt profoundly exposed as private family grief and inheritance matters were debated live on cable news. Camilla faced severe public backlash, with front pages framing her actions as a clandestine plot to sell off the king's private heritage behind his back. When a major newspaper printed a photo of Charles arriving at Sandringham under the headline, "Sandringham sale stopped," the crisis reached its peak. The palace was forced to break its usual silence, issuing an official statement confirming that no land at Sandringham would be sold and that all future estate planning would be conducted jointly by the royal family. To demonstrate unity, Prince William arrived at Sandringham later that day, standing visibly alongside his father. His presence signalled to the public that despite internal differences over estate management, the core stability of the family remained intact. Shortly after, in a quiet room away from the cameras, Camilla offered a direct, personal apology to Charles for excluding him from the process. She accepted that no amount of financial logic could ever justify bypassing his trust. Charles acknowledged his own role in shutting down necessary conversations, agreeing that preservation could not mean ignoring hard economic facts. With William acting as the bridge, the family established a permanent new directive. Heritage would be protected, costs would be managed transparently, and never again would decisions of lasting family significance be made in secret behind closed doors. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden dynamics and legacy battles of the monarchy, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to Prime Royal Central for more in-depth coverage of the stories behind the royal headlines.